Of all the case files I've gone through in that bundle that my contact gave me, this one's got to be one of the weirdest and the saddest. I'll be honest, from the outset, I never really knew much about how big the role was that India played in World War II. Sure, I knew Indian soldiers had fought for the British, but not that the Japanese had actually invaded the borders of India itself. Well, in March of 1944, that's exactly what they did, largely in an effort to stop the British from trying to retake Burma, which they'd also invaded. For 4 months, Indian and British soldiers hammered away at an entire Japanese army and managed to beat it into submission, but they went through hell to do it. One of the main reasons that the Japanese lost that campaign was air superiority. The British were pretty much unopposed over India at that time. RAF fighters and bombers smashed enemy columns and supply routes to pieces, and that Japanese army slowly wilted away. But under battlefield conditions, sometimes those RAF pilots made mistakes, and that's exactly what happened to a trio of Hurricane pilots one evening. They'd just carried out a ground attack in pretty poor weather conditions before landing back at what they thought was an Allied airfield. But in the confusion of the raid, and with the light fading all around them, they'd actually landed at Tamu airfield in Burma, which was held by the enemy. The Japanese forces there watched and waited until all three fighters were down on the ground and the pilots were out of the aircraft before they showed their hand. In the confusion that followed, the three pilots all made a break back to get in their fighters, only for the Japanese soldiers to open fire. This resulted in two of the three being killed, and the third, a Sikh pilot by the name of Flying Officer Gruel, being injured. The Japanese major in charge of the airfield was already pretty disgusted that the British had allowed their planes to fall into captivity just by making a mistake. But when he discovered that Flying Officer Gruel was an Indian, he became even more incensed, and he decided to kill the pilot there and then, on the spot. What was worse, he seized the officer's kirpan, a ceremonial blade that he wore on his uniform, and proceeded to use it to hack the pilot to death. Make no mistake, this wasn't an honourable execution. The report reads like he lost his mind, hacking away, severing limbs and organs until not much was left intact. Deciding to keep the weapon as a trophy, he then ordered his men to dump what remained of the pilot's body into a ditch on the edge of the airfield for animals to scavenge on. Following morning, when the major woke up, he was further enraged to learn that overnight someone had apparently disabled one of the three captured Hurricanes. Inspecting the plane with his ground crews, he found that a couple of lengths of wire from inside were either torn apart or were now missing altogether. Lambasting his sentries for allowing this to happen, he ordered a full search of the base for any evidence of an offender, but there was nothing unusual to be found. So glowering to himself, he then doubled the number of sentries on duty before later retiring to his bed, or at least trying to. Supposedly, so it goes, on this night, he was kept awake by a repeated scrabbling and scratching sound on the exterior of his hut. Now, this wasn't uncommon at the time. There were various other rats and rodents around, but apparently on this time it was persistent, far more than anything he'd experienced before, and it stopped him from getting any effective sleep. Waking up the next day in a foul mood, the major was stunned to learn that a second captured Hurricane had now been disabled. Somebody with a very exact and precise knowledge of what parts they needed to sabotage had apparently managed to get inside and destroy the interior, yanking out chunks of metal and wiring as they did so. Another search of the base was carried out, this time including the bodies of the other two captured pilots his men had shot as they'd run for their planes just in case one had survived. But again, nothing out of the order was there. The two RAF men were both dead, both lying in shallow graves. With one last threat to the men on duty, the major had ordered the sentries to stand in close this time, around the remaining hurricane, and then he stalked off back to his quarters in a vain effort to try and get a good night's sleep. But once again, that didn't happen. For the entirety of the evening, the Major lay awake in his cot, dogged by the sounds of rustling and scratching coming from the walls and the roof of his lodging, as if something or someone outside was clumsily trying to gain access to him. On the morning of the fourth day, the Major staggered up from his bed to find that the inevitable had happened. Once again, despite having men standing only metres away from it, the final RAF Hurricane had been sabotaged. There was metres of wiring torn out and missing, rendering the entire aircraft completely inert. At this point, the Major exploded, his anger directed at everyone who came in range of him. He screamed about the planes, he screamed about whatever it was that was keeping him awake at night. He was yelling about having to be in this country that he now found himself in. And it was so great, this rage that gripped him, that his fatigued body finally gave way and he went crashing down to the floor. Helped up again by his adjutant and some other men, the Major was assisted back to his room and laid down in his cot, whilst his men outside could do little more than hope that this evening was more peaceful for him and for them. But the following morning, the Major didn't get up from his bed. The men outside left him for several hours, reasoning that he might finally be getting some sleep, badly needed sleep, until a decision was finally made to awaken him. But on entering his hut, the Major's staff found themselves recoiling in horror. Their commanding officer was lying dead in his bunk, having been stabbed to death in his sleep. The kirpan of the murdered Sikh officer buried deep down, right in the centre of his chest, pinning him to the bed underneath. And it was being held firmly in place by a lacerated hand and arm, both of which seems to have been clumsily stitched together with lengths of what appeared to be the wiring that had been taken out the hurricanes. That bloodied and shredded patchwork limb was believed to be all that remained of Flying Officer Gruel. The rest of his body, having mysteriously disappeared from the pit where it had been dumped outside the perimeter fence. How? Who knows? But at some point during the previous days, it disappeared, leaving nothing behind but its weapon buried in the man that had killed it.